it is so much, it's so much clearer when you're thinking about how the system is implicit, even in the most abstract category of sheer being, I mean, it's one thing to see the circle. It's another thing to conceptualize the whole as reflected in each of the so-called lesser categories. There's no such thing as a lesser category. There's only the exposition of the system. But the exposition of the system isn't just the exposition, it's the system as a whole, but recited in a certain order such that it conforms to the logic of it. And even saying that, I mean, it's hard to get the whole thing in. Okay, so God. So let's see. So we've already talked about the concept as concept a bit, but yeah, and for everybody watching today, and I'm probably talking to no one in particular. Hang on just a second. Sorry. I'm just gonna my mind is going a million miles a minute. That's what happens when you have cold brew coffee. I say the judgment, it's really judgment. Sorry. I suck. Okay. So what's his name? So Errol Harris starts out on page 224 of his magnificent book saying that the concept is the system or whole determining itself in thought. Okay. And so this has a lot of implications. And then further on the next page, he says the universal is a system. And there's a lot to be specified about that. So he says it's a differentiated whole organized on a principle which determines and integrates its elements. Okay. Each element, being in inseparable and integral relation to every other, is in consequence the complement of every other. So each reflects into its other, opposes itself to it, and unites with it as supplement to specify the universal further. This is a compact statement after getting this far, makes sense to me, but Harris wants to break it out far more in how many steps? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps on page 225. So he says an organized system cannot be posited all at once and, as it were, in a single act because its very differentiations have to be articulated. So this makes sense after reading this far. I mean, it's a long book, right? And everything has to be specified, right? You can't just assert it. You have to prove it. But calling it a proof is really kind of an after the fact kind of thought. If you take that meaning, you can't simply say, well, I'm trying to articulate the proof because, as Houlgate in his commentaries says, you may stop cold. If your reasoning is incorrect, your line of argument may just stop cold at a dead end. And that's always possible. And you have to enter into the study being completely open to this idea that it could stop cold. You know what I mean? So let's see. B, the differences must be specified in terms of one another. So relationally. No single moment can be posited without involving the rest. Accordingly, the specification of the universal cannot take the form of mere addition or collection of similar units. They aren't just a list that are arbitrarily given. Okay. That was Kant's problem, unfortunately, is that he took the logic as he found it in Aristotle and sort of just listed it off and tried to find an organizing principle one way or another. Now he did find organizational principles, and Hegel does acknowledge this, and that's good. But he didn't go so far as to connect them logically in such a way that, I mean, in such a way that it doesn't beg the question. Each moment is therefore a phase in a dialectical development. In each, the whole is immanent, and as they are successfully deployed, the universal principle becomes more fully and more adequately manifested. So from the beginning, he's saying the universal is there. It has to be there, or development does not occur, and what emerges later cannot have emerged from what came before. I posted a rather lengthy quote talking about this on Facebook. Consequently, each phase is a provisional version of the whole, and the successive phases rank as categories, each of which is a specific form of the universal, each being a more complete degree or gradation of realization of the whole. So we're going from abstract to concrete. Sound familiar? It sounds familiar to me when I think of reading Marx's Capital, especially Volume 1, where he goes from the abstract commodity all the way up to the full production system, which is the most concrete and is the producer of the commodity, for, just as a for instance. Yet each is opposed to its immediate predecessor and successor. In fact, each is opposed to any and all of the rest. It provides and is not so, and is so far not what the universal in its fullness demands, and so it is not yet a true manifestation of the whole, right? Whereas its successor, relatively speaking, is. It is opposed to his predecessor as having superseded and so canceled it. I like this word canceled, okay? It's one that Harris chose, but it's basically the same thing as saying negated in Hegel's language, which is awesome because you're getting closer to, in saying canceled, to the German Aufheben, which is both cancel and take up, right? Cancel in the individual sense, but take up in the universal. You add to the universal. You give it one more flavor out of one that has been canceled. This is the dialectic. Is it? Can that be called the dialectic, or is that just? I mean, that's just sublation. The specifications kind of all run together for me. But anyway, so they unite and become identified in a more concrete phase, which is more truly whole. Again, with Marx's Capital, the closer you get to the end, the more you go from abstract to concrete, the more of the whole system is indicated. Therefore, they overlap. So it follows that the concept or concrete universal, that is the self-differentiating system, distinguishes within itself, or better expresses itself diversely as universal, particular, and individual, which are overlapping moments such that each is at once itself and also both of the others. Each is itself and is also the whole. And this is where we get to the point where he talks about how the whole is reflected in the individual and in the particular. The process, and this is the big one for tonight. The process of self-differentiation of the concept is judgment. And here, once again, Hegel uses the etymology of the word Urteil to emphasize his thesis. Judgment is the original primary partition of the concept. Kant had glimmerings of this truth in his recognition that the categories as differentiations of the transcendental unity were the principles of judgment. The categories are principles of order or organization, which is the unification of differences, and such a unification of differences is precisely what is expressed in judgment. Okay, so we come to propositions. This is exactly what we're talking about. In a single act of thought, it distinguishes and identifies the subject and the predicate. There you go. And from here, Harris breaks out what the concept of judgment is, its place in formal logic, and then he goes into the different kinds of judgment, which are the judgment of quality, the two judgments of reflection and necessity, and then the judgment of the concept, which includes modality. And so he goes through, and I'm not sure if I want to read off each of these, but maybe that is necessary. So Hegel calls the judgment of quality the immediate judgment and says that it is the judgment of determinate being, the finite, which is this, not that. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. You have propositions that talk about what something is, like the rose is red, the rose is not red.
Also, if the rose is red, that means it's not blue, it's not purple, it's not black, and so forth.
Qualitative judgments, and this is at the bottom of 231, are commonly held to be true or false, but Hegel declares that they are at best correct or incorrect at the level of finitude to which they apply. Truth is the whole which these judgments as finite fail to exhaust. And thus we get into essence with the judgments of reflection and necessity. The reflective judgment is one of relation and so corresponds to essence, but it still falls short of the explication of the concrete system. Its varieties are the singular, the particular, and the universal judgment. And then he goes through each of these. The singular judgment puts the individual into relation with an other, and the universality of the predicate signifies this relatedness. It is no longer immediate as in the qualitative judgment, but is mediated through the relation. This herb is medicinal. And so you have both the herb and the medicinal, and you have to specify each side, but it only specifies the predicate side so far, right? This is 233 near the top. The judgment could be prompted by purely accidental similarities or by inessential properties incidental to the generic character. The basis of the judgment is still simply the individual as externally observed, right? When we penetrate to the ground of the relation in the systemic structure, which determines the essential nature of the related item, the judgment becomes one of necessity. Okay. And the first stage of the judgment of necessity is the categorical judgment, which is in effect the definition as prescribed by Aristotle. So Aristotle gets really far in, I think, to the determinations that make up a complex judgment. Let's see. The predicate, Hegel says, is the concrete universal, the genus, which contains the specific character, is negative. This judgment is a specification of the universal founded upon the system, which is here expressed in terms of classification. The necessity is at first latent. Gold is a metal, states the connection as universal and necessary, but states it dogmatically without revealing the underlying connection, which it nevertheless implies. Okay, and this is the area basically when you get up to substance, which I believe Errol Harris, in the Science of Logic, he says it's Leibniz and Spinoza. Spinoza is wrong as far as Harris is concerned. He says it's closer to Locke in terms of how the categories and the judgment are handled. I haven't read Locke, so I'll have to take his what's the word? His word for it. Okay. The judgment of necessity. It's interesting because Russell gets close in trying in his logical writings. He gets close to the necessity, but F.H. Bradley in his principles of logic is far closer. Um, and he says why on page 234, I'm not up on formal logic, and so some of this stuff is like mathematics to me. Uh,
That's how formal logic is taught nowadays.
Yeah, it's
It's mathematical logic they teach.
yeah. Let's see. He says what Hegel is urging is that the universal judgment develops or expands into the hypothetical, but he interposes the categorical as distinct from the singular, which he regards as essentially a categorical statement of a universal connection and is more substantial than the judgment of allness. Um, and then he has some Greek I can't read in this format. Um, to mas something lu as opposed to tomata pantos in Aristotle's posterior analytics. Do either of you know what that means? Is that a priori or a posteriori? Is that what that is?
probably using my phone on it.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, and he talks about the hypothetical judgment and the disjunctive, um, and how the disjunctive further differentiates. And on page 235, he has color is either red or yellow or blue, and this is far more complex than the color is red, right? Or the rose is red, because as you can see, more stuff is specified. Um, yeah, I really love how uh how Harris breaks out the language, because on 224 when he talks about the subjective concept, he says that specification is perhaps a better word than differentiation or particularization, because under the influence of the understanding and its analytic philosophy, we tend to think of particulars as bare, as sheerly not universal, and so as having no specification of their own, right? So specification is far more distinctive, specific, right? Something is specified, right? And in that way, Hegel is clearly not just barely analytic. And that's really cool that Harris breaks that out, I think. So at this stage with with necessity, let's see. It is the hypothetical that develops into the disjunctive. Thus, the causal relation is sublated and is intrinsic to the disjunction. Although Hegel does not stress this point, it should follow from what he has said of the categorical and hypothetical forms that they give expression respectively to the categories of substance and causality. So the disjunctive judgment expresses reciprocity. So the wavelengths of light are so interrelated that as their frequency increases, color ranges progressively from red through yellow to blue. It is obvious, however, that these more deep-seated relations are not completely unveiled, even in the disjunctive judgment, and further developed in the syllogism is still required. And reading this, I'm really reminded of Marx's specification in section 3 of chapter 1, where he shows how what's Marx's argument? So you have the linen and it's equal to coffee and shoe leather and this and this and this, but that's not a full systematic specification. And so he's breaking out the necessity of the commensurateness of one of the commodities to an infinite list of all of the other. You know what I mean? Just like the color is either red or yellow or blue. And so it steps through the specifications of what color is. You know what I mean? commodity, commodity is finite, but it also looks rather infinite in the endless series that we continue to churn out every year. You know what I mean? And so Marx in coming to the universal commodity gets to the judgment, gets to the concept itself. And so this is the final one, the judgment of the concept. Yeah, and so 235, he says, the copula is the concept itself. This is true in two senses. The genus is what the disjunction sets out. It is the same on both sides of the judgment. In other words, both sides of the proposition, right? And what identifies subject and predicate is thus the genus itself, right? It's the system, the whole system that's implied. And also the genus is, in the last resort, is the systematic connection or principle of organization, and that is the concept, now set out explicitly and determined as totality. I'll be right back in just a few short minutes, real quick. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, talk about those three. I'll be right back. Okay, yeah. So judgment, as we can see here, is where the full articulation of reasoning starts to really take off. We have the basic element, the concept, and then we have the concept in relation to itself. And that further develops in the judgment of the concept, and then later as the concept as syllogism, which is a series of propositions that more fully articulates what the whole is in relation to itself. And that's really the point, I think, is that previously the concept has not been self-relating. Now it is, right? And it gets more self-relating as we go on, which is really cool, actually.
And I was kind of thinking, because at this point we are taking kind of two bare notions in themselves, and by comparing them to each other, it necessarily, in order to kind of, show how they are equal, has to necessarily go back through the same process of from the immediacy going through the essence through necessity into the final notion of itself. So it's the notion of the notions in that sense.
Yes. Yes, exactly, Kyle. Exactly. And one thing that really knocks me for a loop with the first two doctrines is that they're already giving you the concept of the concept in the articulation of each concept, but it's hard to think of them that way yet. So when we go from sheer being to determinate being and finally to infinity, we're asked to follow along with the development without actually knowing exactly what it's for, other than just the bare description. Because, if you think about it, there's the immediate, there's the mediated, and then there's the full concept given right there in the first chapter. So the the full articulation of how do I say this? The full articulation of concept, judgment, and syllogism is given all in the first chapter, but you can't assume that what they are yet, as specified in the final book. That's really hard. That's probably why this book is so hard to follow, is that if you just started with the third book as written and then went back to the first chapter, you'd be like, okay, all right, there's the immediate and there's the determinate, the negatively determinate being. And then there's the full synthesis, and I hate to use that word because it's more the unification, the full negation of the negation, as the infinite being. What's the first chapter final form? There's sheer being, there's determinate being, and then there's
been too long. Oh wait, it's in front of me.
It's like something in its other. In their unity
There
is
being, nothing, becoming, determinate being, finite, infinite, and then which goes to being for self. Oh, something and other? Is what you're thinking of?
yeah, it's something and other. God, I really should have this memorized. It's chapter 1, for Christ's sake, you know? Come on, guy. Not you, me.
Well, chapter 1 ends at determinate being. You mean
Oh, you're right. Yeah. So really what I'm thinking of is chapter 3.
So yeah, oh man, I forgot how long it is just for infinity.
Oh, you know what? Looking in the encyclopedia, it's labeled as being for itself. That's C, being for itself. So you get the for itself in the most abstract version of being, right? And it's just the bare ass being for itself that's later the moment of everything, right? I say everything, but every other articulation, I guess you could say. Every other fully articulated category is in its fullness for itself, in and for itself. But first of all, you have to have a for itself, right? And an in itself, as a separate category. That's a moment, in order to have it aufgehoben as part of everything else that follows it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, being able to see these bare ass categories backwards and forwards inside each other is really helpful, because yeah, a real teacher of this will have read the entire book and so know why the organization goes along this way. If you just come to it, you pretty much have to just do like Hoolgate says and take Hegel's word for it that he's that it's leading somewhere. That's not just going to end. You know what I mean? Okay. So on page 238, there's a quote here. He says, the judgment, it's the last one before the syllogism. The judgment is a category of the subjective concept, and one normally thinks of it as subjective activity. But Hegel has already protested against this attitude as one-sided. Judgment is just as much objective as its copula declares, the is. So we find him saying that all things are judgments as specifications of a universal. In particular, he asserts that everything is a categorical judgment, for everything has a substantial nature which constitutes its permanent ground. This is no more than a reiteration of his contention throughout that logic is just as much metaphysics. All things have a substantial basis, hence the category of substance, and the categorical judgment expresses at the level of Begriff concept what substance signified at the level of Wesen. Yeah. The structure of the dialectic is such that what is potential at the lower stage is preserved, enhanced, and elucidated at the later. The actual substantial nature of things in the actual world is thus sublated in the higher phases of their evolution up to life and mind, spirit, and in consciousness is preserved as scientific and philosophic knowledge. Okay, judgment therefore is the translation into conscious form of what pertains in the actual world. We shall find this characteristic of the dialectic persisting and shall witness the same return of things upon themselves at later stages. And that's Harris's last word on the judgment before he gets into syllogism. So yeah, he's articulating basic reasoning in detail. It's fascinating how this works.
No, it's the knowing of knowing at this point, right?
Okay. Okay. All right. I suddenly realized, great. Love you. So, I was trying to remember our classes with Alex, Kyle, and I was thinking to myself, wait a minute. Okay. And in the logic, does he actually talk about the modal judgment of concept? And he does. It's when you get into the syllogism that he gives no indication in this book of the syllogism of the concept. And that's because the syllogism of the concept itself comes at the very end of life and spirit. And it has to, because it includes life and spirit. In other words, nature and spirit at the end of the encyclopedia. Okay. But the modality in judgment is the concept. Okay. All right. So I don't have to skip over it. It is actually a thing. And this is really interesting because I think Alex sort of skips over the value judgment as too contingent a bit. But on 236, Harris says, why does Hegel identify the modal forms of judgment as the form of value judgment? Nothing he actually says gives us any explanation. Earlier, he rejected Kant's treatment of modality as merely subjective and insists upon the objectivity of contingency as much as of actuality. So see what he does there? There's actuality and there's contingency, right? And they're both just as important within the system. But Kant's view was that modality is indicated the relation of the object to the knowing subject, that is, to the ego. And Hegel has identified the ego with the concept, which is the whole becoming aware of itself. And that again is the criterion of truth and the standard of value. Judgments which express the relation of the object to the knowing subject, therefore, would precisely be judgments of value, right? As Hegel puts it, the judgment of the concept has the concept, the totality in simple form as its content, the universal in its complete determination. Its first form is assertoric or asserting something, right? In which the subject is individual and the predicate, the reflection of the particular existent in its universal. In other words, the predicate reveals the relationship of the particular phase represented by the individual subject to its universal or ideal completion, i.e., what it ought to be. So this action is good or bad. This landscape is beautiful, right? It gets more into a value judgment area. And then he says, but a merely assertoric statement of value is palpably subjective. And as Hegel implies by his remark that the assertoric form of judgment, though its claim to validity in its own right is commonly rejected by society, has been made the special and an essential form of asseveration in philosophy by appeal to the principle of immediate intuition and belief, an obvious allusion to Jacobi, whom he criticized in the introduction. Further down, the conclusion to which we are led is that all genuine judgment is evaluative. That is, it grasps its subject in its total relationship to the complete system of the real, and ipso facto to the whole experience of the judging subject or ego. That is why we say that it takes a person with great experience to judge soundly. This evaluation, mediated by the concept as a whole, must next be set out as syllogism. So the judgment, right? The judgment is not the full articulation of the concept as the full system, but it is a great deal of it and outlines a great deal of what reason and argument contains. Is that a fair statement?
Say it again, sorry.
No, you're fine. Yeah, judgment contains a great deal of what reason shows up as. Propositions, multiple propositions, further specification and differentiation of what the whole contains, right? So you have the rose is red, all the way up through the action is good, right? And as you go up, you go from a fact to a more specified value judgment, at the very end. After which you have nowhere else to go but to start using the syllogism to break out the value judgments further. Ooh, this is cool. At the bottom of 237, the various traditional forms of judgment which formal logic had drawn from ordinary discourse and scientific exposition and had classified according to their external forms, Hegel has set out as a developing scale. The qualitative judgment simply predicates an immediately perceived quality of a subject, leaving the connection unexplained. The reflective judgment develops the relationship of the terms and discloses uniformities. It represents common sense explanation and an elementary stage in the development of science. This develops as a hypothesis which reveals the ground of the relation and confirms itself as a systematic necessity, right? So we're going up the scale. Finally, the modal forms penetrate to the holism involved in systematic structure, which grounds the judgment as a self-subsistent, self-generating ideal, the apodictic certainty of which is to be further developed in syllogistic form. So it only goes up so far before you have to start using combinations, the syllogism, in other words, of these propositions to more fully, what's the word? Focus in on the whole truth, as opposed to less whole, more contingent, I guess you could say. And then he goes into that last quote I gave. So that's what I have. And this is Harris's interpretation. He tries to hew as much as he can to Hegel's outlook rather than other people, though he breaks out, he breaks out Russell and he breaks out some other people to sort of give you like Bradley, Um, to, to
Well, Bradley was a neo-Hegelian anyway, so
yeah,
Russell was, he was educated by these neo-Hegelian philosophers at Cambridge, even though he rebelled against Hegelian thought, and it still shaped him in a lot of ways.
you're right. And what I really like about what Harris does here is that um, what he breaks out, I think, is that there are definitely advantages to being more um, trained up in these other philosophers because they break out um, far more in a detailed form, even than Hegel in some places. Like if you read Descartes, Descartes breaks out certain stages of reason that Hegel builds on. And so just reading Hegel is great, but it's also not enough necessarily to get the full articulate not only philosophy of history, but um, or history of philosophy, but also the specifications of those different levels. Um,
Also, I was going to say, I did ask ChatGPT where the syllogism of the notion is, and it is under syllogism according to it. It's just because allegedly at this point, the universal, particular, individual no longer remain external to one another, but instead mediate one another in a unified process. It's like it collapses into one thing. That's why there's no three parts of a syllogism of notion. It's all the same thing.
well,
That's
this
objectivity.
you will find the syllogism of the notion in this book.
Yeah. So it's saying it's I guess it's its initial existence, not its final like concrete form.
mhm,
Its initial echo is objectivity, basically.
yeah, I,
Right?
uh, I don't know.
In the rawest form, I guess. That's like I said, it's like I guess the syllogism of the notion as such is
Yeah,
objectivity because it's the universal, particular, and individual all being identical. That's the impression I'm getting from ChatGPT. So that's something I'm going to be looking out for.
what sounds wrong there is that if it's the fully objective, where's the subjective? Right? It's both.
Yeah. Well, eventually, yeah.
Well, not eventually. The subjective is imminent
Yeah.
as much as the objective from the beginning.
Well, I was
Although
thinking in different context. Sorry.
although you don't know that yet.
Yeah. I'm just
Um,
thinking where the subjective and the objective are explicitly linked back together.
yeah, I'm I'm trying to remember. Uh, I think it's just the Alex gave us that final section in our email, like on the last day, and I'm trying to locate it in here, and it's not easy. Ah, okay. Well, I mean, it's the last. Yeah, we're not there yet, and we'll talk about it in the syllogism section. But the final syllogism of the notion, he says the first appearance is formed by the syllogism, which is based on the logical system as starting point with nature for the middle term, which couples the mind with it. So the encyclopedia in its order. The logical principle turns to nature and nature to mind. Nature standing between the mind and its essence sunders itself, not indeed to extremes of finite abstraction, nor itself to something away from them and independent, which is other than they only serves as a link between them, for the syllogism is in the idea and nature is essentially defined as transition point and negative factor and as implicitly the idea. See, I I start reading Hegel as opposed to Harris, and I expect him to use short declarative sentences, and Hegel is not doing that. He won't do that. Still, the mediation of the notion has the external form of transition, and the science of nature presents itself as the course of necessity, so that it is only in the one extreme that the liberty of the notion is explicit as a self-amalgamation. See, this is interesting to me because the first, he says, what this means to me, we're getting back to immediate, mediated, and the full unity. Okay, so when you look at the first syllogism of the notion, its external form is transition. And where do we remember that from? We remember that from the doctrine of the being. Every single category is transitioned from one to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other, until you get to the end and into essence. And at that point, you go into, instead of transition, you go into, what is it? It's relation, or it's opposite, or something like that. Damn. Okay. Hang on. Because you know what? Okay, this is it. It's page 220 in the Errol Harris. He talks about this. So so he says, this is the essential character of development. It is the peculiar process of the concept, the explication of the implicit as the becoming manifest of what has hitherto been immanent. As in being, transition, and in essence, reflection. Okay, so first book, we have transitions. Second book, we have reflections, were the typical forms of dialectical progression. In the concept, the appropriate form is development. Transition and reflection were premonitions, but not yet transparent exemplifications of development, and only now from the viewpoint of the concept can they be seen as forms or phases of the same process, right? So there you go. You come across the first syllogism of the notion. It's there. The form of the encyclopedia looks mystical because it's just the immediate impression. Therefore, from logic to nature to mind, look like transitions only. That's it. That's what it is. So if you just read it straight through, right, as just a single syllogism and stop thinking about it from there, they still look like transitions and still ideal, right? The key to Hegel's system is going into the second and the third syllogisms of the notion in order to break out the reflection and then the development phases, right? So 576 of the last part says, in the second syllogism, this appearance is so far superseded that syllogism is the standpoint of the mind itself, but spirit, which as the mediating agent in the process, so spirit is the middle right now, presupposes nature and couples it with the logical principle. It is the syllogism where mind reflects on itself in the idea. Philosophy appears as a subjective cognition of which liberty is the aim and which is itself the way to produce it. So as you see here, mediation and reflection is reflected in the second syllogism of the notion. For our viewers, I'm skipping way ahead here and talking about this because I'm trying to break out even at the very end that the breakout process from the immediate, which is transitional, to the mediative, which is reflective, to the final form, which is development, and is the final syllogism. So I'll just read this real quick. He says, the third syllogism is the idea of philosophy, which has self-knowing reason, the absolute universal for its middle term. So logic is in the middle, right? A middle which divides itself into mind and nature, making the former its presupposition. So spirit and then logic and then nature as process of the idea's subjective activity, and the latter its universal extreme as process of the objectively and implicitly existing idea. The self-judging of the idea into its two appearances characterizes both as its manifestations. Love you, hon. Good night. And in it, there's a unification of the two aspects. It is the nature of the fact, the notion, which causes the movement and development. Yet this same movement is equally the action of cognition. The eternal idea in full fruition of its essence eternally sets itself to work, engenders and enjoys itself as absolute mind. So where just for the audience and for you too as well, but I think he makes it pretty clear that most readings or interpretations of Hegel stop at the first syllogism, especially Marxist. A lot of Marxist interpretations stop at the first syllogism and say Hegel's system is idealistic. Because for example, the transition from absolute idea to nature is just that. It's just a transition and kind of a clunky looking one. When Hegel says that the absolute externalizes itself into nature, this can't really be specified as a form of development unless you look at the full syllogism of concept. Does that make sense to you guys? Like it makes sense if you know the whole system, but if you don't know the whole system, then it looks like just sort of an idealistic assertion. And yeah. Okay, my brain just grew 2 sizes.
Hmm.
I already knew this part sort of or better after Alex's class, but there's so much information that even the judgment and its development at this stage is hard to take in. Because there's so much of it, you know what I mean? To go from the rose is red to a full value judgment, and every stop along the way, that's a lot. It's funny because Houlgate, in his book on the opening of Hegel's logic, he says that going from sheer being to the end of infinity, which is all he covers in that book, is more than enough for one term, just one single teaching term, right? Now imagine reading the whole system within the same time. You're going to be overwhelmed by an awful lot of content, and I'll shut up. Kind of talking as I'm thinking. I'm sorry. I'll be right back. So what do you guys think? Clear as mud?
This is getting clearer and clearer every time.
Yeah.
I think what you said about Marxist interpretations of Hegel, that was especially true for the official Soviet interpretations.
See, and this is my basic contention. I'm not saying that Marx's interpretation of Hegel is necessarily fully clear, but there are an awful lot of interpreters that try to clarify it, and I just don't think there's enough information to say definitively whether Marx fully appreciated it. I think he did, or he had to, in order to apply the method correctly in his own work, which I think he did as far as he could. But all of these interpretations uh, fall short of an understanding of Hegel so much that it's hard to tell what Marx thought, other than in the brief snippets and letters and his work itself. So
I think the Soviet philosopher who really did try to understand Hegel was Ilyenkov, and basically that guy eventually got him to a whole lot of hot water.
and he was rather a latecomer to the entire question. Ryazanov preceded him and didn't get to finish his work, unfortunately. He was executed, right?
Which one?
Uh, R- David Ryazanov, I think his name is.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I couldn't remember if he was
Ilyenkov
exiled
killed
or. Yeah, probably.
because basically he wasn't too. I mean, he was not someone he did not set out to be a dissident or anything like that. But
Well, none of them did.
But after a while, the Soviet establishment treated him like he was a dissident, and that's what led to his suicide.
Jesus. Okay, yeah. I just saw your post, Kyle.
Yeah, I was waiting that for later, but
Oh, you're fine. Um, I, I've also shied away from trying to use Chat GPT because so much of what has been fed into Chat GPT are lesser interpretations, I think.
I just thought it stated what I was kind of trying to think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like mine's like the initial formal. We do get to the formal syllogism of the notion, but not the fully realized version of it.
Right. And
so, yeah.
Well, the number of people who have read all three books and are familiar with the contents, you could probably count on a couple of hands, even across the whole history. And of course, the problem with that is that if you don't get the full articulation of the syllogism of the notion, I mean, you don't even get to the in and for itself of the whole.
Right.
Right. In fact, I'm not even sure if you get to the in itself. Like maybe you do. Because isn't in itself the essence?
It's kind of it's kind of the seed that hasn't become the plant. So is that
I'm trying to remember what substance was. Substance is in itself. It's implicit, right? It's the implicit whole. Substance, according to Hegel, is the implicit whole, whereas the in and for itself is the explicit whole. And if you're just going by the first syllogism, then you're just immediate, transitional, the end.
right?
Which the way this is organized, it's hard to break out which level you're talking about, because if you start from the bottom at being, it contains the transitional, the reflective, which is the determinate, and then the in itself, which is the developed. But you're still in the transitional phase of the notion. So the transitional phase of the notion, doctrine of being, contains all three forms in each of the categories' development. But you're not told what all three levels mean explicitly until the final book, like the subjective the subjective section of the logic. It's pretty freaking cool. You have to, yeah, you have to really keep track of where you are, because even if the reflective and the developmental is there in the first book, it doesn't mean that the implications are fully drawn out, I guess you could say. It looks very idealized. If you just read the logic through nature, through mind in that order, God, well, it makes me wonder. So you have the three, okay, and they're in transitional order, first syllogism order, right? It almost makes me wonder if drawing out the implications of the second and the third syllogism would imply another couple volumes. You know what I mean? Because the content of the system is all there, but how, when logic is the middle term, and then mind, spirit is the middle term, it has far different implications for the contents. Does that make any sense? And
not right now.
What's that?
Not right now.
Okay. So first syllogism, logic, nature, spirit. Okay.
Yeah.
And it draws out the transitional implications of the system from the abstract to the concrete. You go into the second syllogism, where the middle term is what is it? Fuck. Where spirit is the mediating, is the middle term in the second syllogism, right? And so you're talking about a process where mind mediates between nature and logic. In other words, nature becomes logical through the mind in the second syllogism, right? And so if you take any logical category, right? If you take any natural category and link it up with a logical one through the mind, this has implications that haven't been drawn out yet. And I wish I could just sit here and give you something, whatever it is. So the mind perceives time, right? The mind perceives time which precedes it, and the mind orders it logically into concepts such as what's a time-related subject or time-related category, like quantity or measure. Measure would be a better one. So you know how measure has characteristics which we usually think of in terms of time and space, but are actually intrinsic to the category of measure without reference to time. What Hegel is saying at the end in the second syllogism is that mind orders what we find in nature in terms of what we perceive as time and space into logical categories like measure. So the mind mediates those natural phenomena into universal phenomena in the logic. Does that make sense? So there's an example. There's just one bare ass example, right? Now try to catalog all of those all of those transitions in the second syllogism, right? I bet you come up with an endless catalog which would fit into a dictionary sized tome. You know what I mean? Which Hegel only hints at in the final closing pages of Philosophy of Spirit. That just blows my mind. That there's far more implied than just the three books in what he's given us. And then the third
lived to be 61, so
yeah,
they probably would have written on that stuff.
yeah. And the third syllogism is the idea of philosophy. So the third syllogism, logic itself, is the mediating term. And it divides itself into mind, spirit, and nature, making the former its presupposition. Okay, so you have spirit, you have logic, and then you have nature. And this last one, if I read it correctly, is the fully articulated idea mediating between our subjective consciousness and nature around us. So the third syllogism would be the scientific principle. We look at our environment around us and we order it according to the logic. Mind orders nature. Get it?
Yeah.
So human uses system to systematize nature. That's the scientific principle, right? That's the third syllogism. And that the contents of those observations correctly stated would be a more complete form of scientific observation, more so than the understanding gives us in the sciences today, the bourgeois sciences. So the third syllogism should be the target that we as Marxists aspire to when talking about anything scientifically. When we mean scientifically, we mean the third syllogism.
And it is the species being in that sense, kind of it's part of that, in and for itself.
Yeah. And its capability to order logically, making sense of its environment and making sense of how its environment not only precedes ourselves historically, but also understands it and ourselves as one big whole, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? So and I'm pretty sure this is what Marx gets at with his historical materialism, is that he includes all three of the syllogisms, although to what degree I can't say, because I'm not that up on the full articulation, I guess you could say. And what it means for us and for all the viewers who are listening in on how much of Hegel you really need to understand. I mean, there's no excuse not to read Philosophy of Nature and Philosophy of Spirit if you want the full articulation of how all of this works. Because if you take any part of the syllogism and reorder them in the order of singularity, particularity, and universal, you're gonna come across different insights, any one of which you can't really afford to leave out or just sort of summarize over as, oh yeah, I already understand that. In the introduction to the encyclopedia system, at the very beginning, one of the things Hegel talks about is that philosophy is one of those areas which a lot of people just sort of assume that they know what the contents are and start to philosophize without actually knowing what they're doing. Right. And this is, I think, I think this is the biggest defect of philosophy today, is that most of them think that you can get all of the content you need from intuition, from sensory exposure, and that's all you need. Right? What comes to you immediately can be ordered, and you're fine. And this is not the case. This is why Bertrand Russell fails, only gets to a certain level, and why Hegel gives us gives us the whole outline from which to work, but he doesn't give you every permutation, which is why at the end of this, the book literally ends after talking about the shape of the three syllogisms. That's all he gives you. We have to climb the mountain, do the work, take the a non-royal road in order to specify our subject in all three articulations of the syllogism of the notion. Sounds daunting, doesn't it? I suck.
Oh, well, that
And
feels.
speaking of analytical philosophy, I remember a Soviet philosopher I read, Igor Nautov, who was like writing probably during the late Brezhnev era, and his book Alternatives to Positivism is actually mostly about analytical philosophy. But one of the things that conclusions are in that book is that a lot of analytical philosophy eventually comes to Hegelian type conclusions, even though these guys are don't regard themselves as being Hegelians and probably never read Hegel, but they eventually reach Hegelian type conclusions. And and I remember he spent a lot of time with Popper. Actually, Popper, was an avowedly anti-Hegelian philosopher. But
Yeah.
that shows how Popper actually arrived at many Hegelian type conclusions anyway.
Right. And like it reminds me of Marx, because if Marx can be said to not completely having understood every aspect of Hegel's system, which I can't really tell whether he did or not to the fullest. I think he did, but I can't show that. In any scientific endeavor that you do, even at Popper's regressive level, he can't help but follow some of those same paths that Hegel maps out in his system, because it's all one. It's all one philosophic system. It's all one reality in which reason works. So the broken clock, everybody is capable of it, because everybody is dealing on the same playing field, whether they acknowledge it or not, is what I think you're getting at, Jim. And I think it really is true.
You see, another analytical philosopher like Quine was famous for showing that the distinction that people have been drawing between analytic propositions and synthetic propositions, that really it's really sort of illusory.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's
obviously Quine made no mention of Hegel, so
well,
of
yeah,
course.
of course not. I kind of hate Kuhn for doing that, while also getting an awful lot of it right.
Yeah.
Whether he's willing to acknowledge it or not. it kind of uh it kind of amuses me that Popper and Stalin share so much ground in disregarding Hegel, but both of them are forced down Hegel's roads anyway.
Yeah.
In certain aspects. I've heard Harrison say on more than one occasion that Kant was a mistake. Um, but at the same time, if you read Kant through Hegel, um, you can see why Hegel praised him for getting further than the empiricists did and trying to reconsider how a lot of this shit works. So I'm a little bit more optimistic that Kant was there, because even if Kant did try to drive back things toward a more religious friendly outlook, um, he sort of contradicted himself between the practical critique and the pure one.
Yeah. Yeah. And McKine had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And Fichte was one that shouldn't be disregarded either, because he further specified what Kant did, although not as fully as Hegel. And he further developed what would eventually become the doctrine of the notion. But it wasn't a fully it wasn't a fully articulated version yet. Like, it was and it wasn't, I guess you could say. The fact that he started with the ego as opposed to landed on it after the unity of being an essence, I think was the chief defect. But even saying that, I'm just asserting it. I haven't read Fichte. I'll need to. Jeez, the shit never ends. All right, it's 9:19. What do people think? We should probably look at reading. Start reading the syllogism section, which is chapter 3, I want to say. Stop me if I'm wrong. This is going to be a
Chapter 3.
long one.
It is, yeah. 664 to 704, so 60 pages. Wait a minute. Wow. Yeah, 40 pages.
Yeah. So why don't we divide it into two? And so we do about 20 pages of the syllogism up to 685. What does 685 say?
It's 686 actually. When it
Yeah. So the beginning of syllogism all the way up to the end of A. So the syllogism of quality. Yeah. So let's read up to 686.
Yes.
And
The fact that
what's up?
I was gonna say the fact that the syllogism of existence is pretty much that entire section, entire half.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So it's the judgment is the qualitative judgment, but the existential syllogism. So even in the labels, do you see kind of how the specification that you go to from quality to existence is more explicitly developed, right? In the judgment, you have a quality that you break out. In the syllogism, you have more of an existence, right? In the first, which is just fascinating. How that comes across. I love how specific it gets. Anyway, cool. All right. All right. With that, I'm spent and I'm exhausted. So I'm going to bid you two adieu and hope you have great weeks.
Yep.
And everybody else watching, keep following along if you're watching this, because we're going to get into the philosophy of nature and spirit after this and really get into some ground none of us have probably got very far into at all previously. So have a good night, comrades. Take care.